took me a little while to settle on the topic of today's video. The occasional flash of aggro alt-rock goodness in Beck's extensive discography left me a little bit hungry for some more of that, so I was weighing up a few options from that era, and at first was either going to go for your favourite band's favourite band, the angry sludge peddlers Melvins, or the noise junkies turned prog rock virtuosos Motorpsycho, but the problem with both of those bands is they both have stupidly large discographies, and particularly after having just done Beck, I kind of wanted to do something a little bit more bite-sized, something I could just sort of get through without it feeling like quite so much of an undertaking, right? So my third choice was these guys, Failure, a band that I've been into for a long-ass time now and have followed their post-hiatus renewed discography with great interest, so it seemed like a bit of an obvious pick. But hell, if there's one thing I can do, it's obvious, so here we are. Today I'll be reviewing all 6 of their full-length albums, plus their post-breakup compilation record, and putting them on a scale that looks like this. As ever, these are just like my opinions, man, so try not to get too mad if I put them in the wrong place, but hopefully we can have a nice little chat about what I think makes these albums work and what I think doesn't occasionally. Feel free to dunk on my bad opinions in the comments, it's fine, I'm quite thick-skinned at this point. Anyway, without further ado, let's travel all the way back to the early 90s, that wonderful time of heroin and dirty flannel shirts, and look at one of the bands who perhaps didn't quite manage to ride the grunge train to superstardom. Let's go! The fact that alt-rock mega-producer Steve Albini was the guy to take the reins on production on this album comes as an immense surprise to me. Honestly, I've heard this album quite a few times in the past and I had no clue that he had anything to do with this. Despite being like a seasoned peddler of noise rock himself, Albini's sound is normally a lot more clinical, a lot more crisp. You can pick anything out of the arrangement because everything is normally up front and in your face, right? Like, even on some of the noisier moments of Nirvana's In Utero, for example, everything is there. This album is muddy as hell. I don't know if that was a conscious decision or just a bad mixing job, I honestly couldn't tell you, but something doesn't feel right on this record, especially given Failure's own penchant for space rocky, prog rocky influence, right? I wouldn't say this never works, Open a Submission, which is probably the noisiest, muddiest track on here, I actually do quite like. It's a really distinctive sound, it's got a weirder, offbeat, proggier riff, but drowned in all this dirty production. It sounds unsettling in a good way, right? And honestly, the record does start pretty strong in general. Something isn't their strongest track they've ever written, but it does sort of set the blueprint for what they'd go on to do a lot on the following record. Sort of noisy, hypnotic, high-register guitar riff to lead the thing in, and then sneering vocals over a big powerful riff in the chorus. It's a solid alt-rock tune. Macaque ain't bad either, it's more ponderous, more stripped down. The weird lyrical content of seeing a monkey in the zoo and basing your entire philosophy after its lifestyle is a little bit odd, but honestly these guys do odd quite well, so I'm not innately adverse to that. I do think Screen Man is the better example of this more ponderous style though. The rhythm section just chugging along, there's an inevitability, a sort of unstoppable momentum to it. And I like the way the sort of more detached, ominous, cold verse vocal performances play off against these absurdly noisy, I wouldn't even call it a guitar solo really, it's just a handful of notes, but just drowned in this wall of feedback. I don't think this track is quite like anything they would go on to do, but it absolutely has its own vibe and I'm here for it. After that though, I think the album loses momentum a bit. I mean, there's good ideas here and there. I like how Muffled Snap starts with these sparse drum fills over this really quiet intro. But then it builds into not much, really. Pro Catastrophe has an absurdly groovy bass tone, it sounds like it came straight out of a funk song, just a load of little hammers-ons and bends and stuff. But then presumably they just thought that was enough to make the song and just farted out a basic by-the-numbers alt-rock piece over the top. Princess is clearly trying to be a more punk-inspired number, it's, heavier guitars, minute and 20 in length, just flies along at a pretty rapid pace, but there's just nothing to sink your teeth into here. And the closer, Salt Wound, is just a bit of a mess, honestly. I do not agree with the decision to bury the vocals in the mix in a shoegazy sort of style when the track is far more immediate and more aggressive. It feels like a weird contrast of worlds. And while I usually enjoy what this track does at the end, where it gradually slows in tempo and sort of deteriorates into just a wall of noise, I think this does it too abruptly. It's almost like someone flicked an off switch, you know? Like, tracks have done this really well from other bands, but this one is unwilling to sort of take the time to really evolve the song in that way. Plus, the second half of this entire track is just like an unrelented instrumental piece. The band do this a lot throughout their career, little segues between songs, and I usually quite like it when they do that, but this one really does just sound like instrument technicians just warming up, right? Just having a little gentle jam session. It doesn't really go anywhere, just takes up space really. I think I'd probably be a bit more charitable towards this record if it wasn't for the fact that I am intimately familiar with their later work, know what they would go on to do, and can't help but draw comparisons. Maybe if I was an alt-rock fan in 1992, I would be heralding these guys as the second coming, but going back to this record with modern context, I don't see a great deal of value in it. I think best I can do is low C tier. Magnifies sees the band return with a similar alt-rock focused sound to what they were doing on Comfort, but this time not only with like considerably stronger songwriting across the board, but also with the more like focused precision point production that was missing from the first album. Empty Friend is probably a great example of this. It's probably my least favourite song on the album, clearly the one most intended for radio play with its big sing-along chorus, and its neat dramatic moments like dropping into a little acoustic version of the chorus towards the back half of the song, only to then explode back into the usual wall of noise. But yeah, the production really brings out like the really distinctive bass tone and the crisp drumming on this track as well, which would have just been lost on Comfort. And on the better songs, it really just elevates them into, honestly, some of my favourite cuts from this entire sound in the early 90s. Like both Wonderful Life and Bernie are clear like precursors to the more psych rock, space rock sort of sound that they'd be leaning into on the next record. And the crispness just really works for them here. Like Bernie's like tight little arpeggios and groovy little funk riff, and then massive, explosive, soaring guitar screeches. It's all front and centre and it all like gels so well, whereas Wonderful Life is a lot more subtle. The choruses on this thing managed to soar despite the sort of monotone, sarcastic vocal delivery, just through the layers of reverb and double tracking and everything that just sort of pushes the song upwards and outwards. It's like quite an aggressively, as I said before, sarcastic and nihilistic tune, and I think the brightness of it like juxtaposes with that really well. I think that sort of vibe is present across this whole album. Magnified's probably the worst offender of that, perhaps. While I enjoy the song, I think it's got a really cool riff to it. I have to admit the sort of sarcastic, moralistic grandstanding in the pre-chorus does grate on me a little bit. But I do like the lyric of "the sun's just a big glass and we're all ants." Like, it conveys the message just bluntly. This song and Wet Gravity both end with segues like they were doing on the previous album, little musical interludes, but in both cases they're really cool here. This one's all like backmasked chimes, supporting a haunting little acoustic guitar piece, whereas Wet Gravity's is just this like solid wall of guitar molasses, just overdriven, fuzzy LSD soundscapes, right? That song's pretty cool as well, Wet Gravity that is. It allows the rhythm section to really stand front and centre, just this rumbling monster of a bass line and overwhelming clattering drums. And the guitar only comes in just to sort of screech some noise over the top of it all occasionally. It might not be the easiest listen on the record, but it is very cool. Same can be said for Closer Small Crimes actually, which also buzzes along on this monstrously abrasive bass tone, and then pairs that up with like an almost like nursery rhyme vocal performance and little twinkly music box guitar pieces. It's again a great use of like contrasting ideas. I also like the way this song does the fake fade out thing and then comes back in with more layers of guitar and piano and this huge like climax, which the song would have felt sorely missing otherwise. I've got to say my favourite tracks are both towards the front of the album though. I sometimes worry that Frogs might be the exact song that Blur were parodying with Song 2, with this like super catchy, bouncy, hard rock riff and lyrics about going to get your head checked. I've got to say though, as much as I do love Blur, I think this beats the Woohoo song hands down. The lyrics can be a little bit edgy, but I kind of like them for that. And the searing, screeching guitar solo really does like sound like something out of a horror movie. It really underpins the insanity narrative here. And then Moth is probably like my favourite grunge song, like full stop. Like I can't think of a song that does this sort of style better. Absolute masterclass of the quiet, loud dynamic. The way the guitars just erupt in the choruses. The vocal hook that feels like incomplete, but in a way that sort of becomes an earworm in and of itself, the way you're sort of wanting more. The absolute like beating pulse of this song. Again, the rhythm section on this whole album is so good. So yeah, all things considered, this is such a step up from the first album and is like peak this sound of Failure. Everything they do after this sort of steadily moves away from this, but if you want some noisy alt rock to get sad to in your bedroom, then you're not going to do much better than this. I'll go A tier for now on account of a few tracks not quite hitting the spot for me, but an easy argument could be made for S. I'm concerned I might be too close to Fantastic Planet to be able to review it fairly in any way. More so than any album I've spoken about in this series so far, this is like one of my favourite records of all time. Like, I'm talking top 10, I might even be talking top 5. Like I sometimes do with S-tier albums, I've picked more than my usual 3 highlights on here, but narrowing it down to 5 was difficult. Like, I've had to exclude the hectic, bombastic alt-punk of Pillowhead, Solaris's immaculate percussion and like super compelling gritty chorus vocals, Another Space Song's spectral, floaty ambience, and Blank's like raw honesty and compelling pop sensibilities. Like, even when the album sort of wavers into sort of more generic alt-rock sounds like on Pitiful or Open a Saturday Saviour, it always like does something to really reel me back in, right? Like, either the chord progression's really distinctive, or the guitar tone is like super lush and drawing me in, or if it's the vocal melody or the lyrical content or something, like every single one of these tracks is just good. And that includes the 3 segues, this time separated off into their own tracks as they always should have been on previous albums. Just beautiful little interludes that aid the flow of the album when perhaps 2 tracks wouldn't have connected quite so smoothly. Because this album flows, like every track just sets up the next one perfectly. Like, a record can have good songs or be a good album in most cases. This one is both. And I haven't even mentioned my 5 highlights yet, my god. The interplay between the fried out guitar riff and the rumbling bass and Smoking Umbrellas that builds into this huge ass chorus, a facet which it shares with Dirty Blue Balloons, which honestly, like, the aching rawness of the I've waited so long without you is so good. And that's before we get to the guitar solo on that track, which just rips. Like, I am not necessarily a guitar solo guy. I don't have a great deal of interest in listening to Eddie Van Halen shred, but like, sometimes they hit the spot, right? Like, the impactful articulation of Comfortably Numb, or the noisy, rowdy, in-your-face screeching of Paranoid Android, and the guitar solo on Dirty Blue Balloons, and also the one on Daylight, the closer, basically marry both of these 2 styles together perfectly. Like, these are some of my favourite guitar solos ever written. Daylight is a hell of a closure as well. The clockwork mechanical grinding in the background that sets up this gorgeous reverbed like arpeggio, and the huge yelling closing statement of Daylight won't find us here. I love that shit. And Heliotropic sets that up for a home run as well. That song is so dark, so oppressive, that the daylight breaking through on the closer is like elevated into a moment of absolute beauty. Heliotropic takes no prisoners, like the immense bass tone, the thudding drums, the pained vocal delivery of these truly like lost lyrics. I know my faith had meaning, but I've forgotten why. Like, wow. And then there's The Nurse Who Loved Me, which I think is quite possibly indisputably the best song on the album, with some fierce competition. That song just absolutely nails one of my personal musical fetishes of like starting out as like a simple like acoustic piece and just building and building, adding in layers of different sounds, musical instrumentation, just accentuating each passing verse until it climaxes. Like, God, this is sounding disgustingly sexual, but I can't help it. This song goes so hard. So yeah, I mean, like, if I had an S+ tier, this would go in there. It's a 10 out of 10 album. Like, I cannot talk up how much I enjoy this record enough. And let's move on before I embarrass myself further. So for a long time that was it. 3 albums, break up due to personal differences, the end. And then in 2004 the band decided to throw the superfans a bone by releasing this collection of self-described unreleased sounds and images. Essentially a couple of outtakes and some early demos, and I think maybe they should have stayed that way. Unreleased, that is. Okay, the good first. Wake Up isn't a bad song. This is marked as an outtake from Fantastic Planet. More realistically, I think it was probably an early demo from that era. The chorus melody has an eerie resemblance to that of Solaris. The guitar solo bears a lot of similarity to those that appear on Daylight and Dirty Blue Balloons. The verse doesn't quite feel fully baked, but it's got enough of what I like from Fantastic Planet to hold up as a decent song, so I enjoy this one. Golden and Petting the Carpet, the latter of which was the Comfort outtake, are both fairly solid alt-rock pieces, some pretty cool musicianship going on, particularly Petting the Carpet. This has a lot of really cool guitar work on it. Both suffer heavily from that early 90s production, presumably Golden was from around that era as well. Again, it's very muddy, doesn't feel very vibrant particularly. But there was obviously some potential here. Petting the Carpet would go on to be remade for a later album, and I can see why this track was chosen over the other cuts from this record. The other track to be remade was Pennies, which is also quite a good song. This one definitely benefited from the overhaul it would get later, but here it's like a simple acoustic piece. It's got a really primally simple vocal melody that just really does the trick. It's about as no frills as Failure have ever been, but it works for them quite well here, I think. And this is where my praise is starting to wane. I have a love-hate, more like-hate relationship with Mange. I think it has a pretty cool off-kilter bass line in the beginning, and the lyrics comparing abruptly ended relationship to abandoning a dog to die are visceral, but do their job, I think. My main issue with it is just it goes on way too long, 6.5 minutes long, and half of it is just repeating the chorus and the bridge just over and over again ad nauseum until you just sort of start to think the band had no idea how to end it. It's a pretty common thing on this album, honestly. Lucky Shoreline's not a bad song. I do quite like the chorus hook on this one as well, but also just far too long, just drags where it doesn't need to. And then tracks like Gone and Closer You're Too Much are honestly too long by their entire duration because they're both just boring as fuck, man. And they both got these really simple stripped down verses which could work well in contrast to really powerful statement choruses, but they just don't have them. The choruses are barely the final twitching of the roadkill that is these songs. Shrine at least tries something. This is the opener. It's going for a more shoegazy thing, really noisy, distorted, feedbacky guitars all over it, and I don't know, I feel like an attempt was made, but the band just didn't really understand that style of music. There's just no emotional resonance, no life in it, really. And Untitled really annoys me. I do quite like the little guitar lick that heralds the single line of a chorus on this song, but my god, that 80s ass Take My Breath Away synthy bass tone just annoys the fuck out of me. So yeah, it's probably not fair to rate these tracks on the similar level to the other albums considering they were actual released material, but eventually so was this, and it's not good. I don't think I've ever had an artist so far in this series swing from S tier to D tier over the course of a single album, but first time for everything. So the band's comeback in 2015 was clearly very eager to prove that they were picking up exactly where they left off and there would be no changes, right? The fact that 6 of the 18 tracks on here are segues feels like an obvious nod to Fantastic Planet, and opening and closing with them really felt like an indicator that they were just continuing from the final note of Daylight and that they were going to continue from here, even if Segue 4 is essentially just a glorified intro to Hard Traveller. There does also seem to be a real effort to play up their sort of 90s bona fides, right? Normally vocalist Greg Andrews sounds like, to my ear at least, somewhere between Kevin Shields and Liam Gallagher, but there seems to be a few cases on this album where he's attempting a more Kurt Cobain-y inflection, as if to say, yeah, we were part of the grunge movement and we're still here. And yeah, for a while on this record, they genuinely do seem to just be just as good as when they left. AM Amnesia is honestly just as good as anything on Fantastic Planet. It's, you know, super spacey, really powerful riffs, soaring choruses. It's basically everything you'd want from a Failure song. The same can be said for the reinterpretation of Petting the Carpet from Golden. It's so elevated here, there's so much more depth, there's so many extra layers of guitar, there's an entirely new bridge in here that name drops the album title. You wouldn't think this was a dredged up throwback song. It sounds just as fresh and invigorated as anything else on the record, perhaps more so in some cases. I do really like Snow Angel as well. It's ostensibly like a really clean, finger-picky guitar track, very sort of laid bare for the verses, just like the odd sort of psychedelic prog rocky effect and just these pounding, resonant, sparse drums. But then those drums like kick into overdrive for the choruses and it just all explodes, and it's a really good balance of the quiet and the loud. Also towards the front of this album you've got Atom City Queen and Counterfeit Sky, two tracks that could have been fairly middling realistically, but they are both carried so hard by these incredible riffs. So distinctive, like the guitar tone on them as well as the notes played. In fact, I'm just going to play both those riffs for you now. Cool as hell, right? Cool as hell. I do think they begin to lose steam a little bit after Petting the Carpet. There's no tracks on here that I actively dislike. I want to get that out of the way now. There's nothing here as bad as the worst things on Golden or even Comfort. I mean, they may not necessarily be to my taste, but I do think Mulholland Drive and The Focus are both interesting sort of spins on the formula. The latter sounds like a more conventional post-grunge piece, like Foo Fighters-esque, high energy, heavy riffing, sort of bullish meathead of a song a little bit, whereas Mulholland Drive is honestly more like inspired by like 60s bubblegum pop, almost show tunes almost. Like there's a real sort of nostalgic, almost like doo-woppy sort of vibe about it, but both of these tracks are sort of filtered through the lens of Failure and have their sound sort of stamped all over them, so while they may not necessarily be to my taste, I think they do still fit here. There are a few tracks that I think the album could have done without. Again, not necessarily bad, but relatively underwhelming, come crashing, Otherwhere. Fair Light Era to an extent, although the lead chorus line being "big trash on the radar" just makes me think of that one Futurama episode, and that makes me happy. Thankfully, Effective Closer, I Can See Houses picks things up again in a big way. I really like that song. It's got a lot of like Porcupine Tree sort of energy, that sort of subtle, spacious, imposing, proggy vibe. It really punches with impact when it needs to, but for the most part is just very like nonchalant in like a chilling way. Long before I started this channel, I used to still compile lists of my favourite albums every year because I'm that sort of nerd, and back in 2015 I was basically telling everyone that this was my album of the year. I wouldn't go that far anymore. In fact, I'm sure I could name a bunch of better records from that same year that share a colour palette with the album art, but as a return to form, this does the trick. It absolutely does. It does almost seem like they never left, and I would call this a pretty solid B tier. You know, I never picked up on this back when I was listening to this album in 2018, but I'm pretty certain this is a concept album. I don't know, listening through it now, I started picking up on some lyrics here and there, and I honestly had a little bit of a sinking feeling that this was like a vaguely conservative sort of young people and their technology shakes fist in the air sort of old man concept here, especially with tracks named things like Force-Fed Rainbow, but doing my best to sort of unpick the dense cryptic lyricism on this album. I think there's a little bit more of a sort of spiritual sort of vibe to it, a sort of vague warning against putting our faith in the artificial as opposed to the human, and a pretty drastic undercurrent of apocalyptic doom-mongering. The reason I talk about all this when I'm not really a lyrics guy generally is because this is a very different Failure album. It's way more vibe-centric, way less sort of, here's a cool riff, here's a neat hook, you know, way more building a tone, building an atmosphere to sort of portray this more intricate lyrical style. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's less like drastic highlights, right? There's no Nurse Who Loved Me on here, there's no Daylight, there's not even a Petting the Carpet. But as like a consistent piece, it's quite enjoyable. There's a few duds on here, don't get me wrong. I'm not a big fan of the more high energy, rockier tracks on here. Tracks like No One's Left and Found a Way, they're fine, they're not bad, but they do sort of take me out of the general tone of the album quite a bit. I think Another Post-Human Dream sort of drones on a little bit as well. This and What Makes It Easy are both more of these sort of vaguely twee sort of ballads like Mulholland Drive on the previous album. But I do quite like What Makes It Easy. The sort of shuffling waves of percussion on the verses really elevate it a lot, and honestly, as sort of kitschy as the choruses are, I do quite like them. And while we're talking ballads, we've also got Pennies on here. I mean, I like the song on Golden. I actually think the Golden version is better though, honestly. This version drags the song out a little bit, it adds a couple of extra bridges in that don't do much for me, and I actually just quite like the more sort of stripped down acoustic sort of style for this song. It's still good here though. If you want to talk stronger tracks though, one of my favourites is the opener, Dark Speed. It's quite a dark, like throbbing pulse of a song, and I do quite like the vocal delivery on here as well. It actually kind of reminds me of Beck, funnily enough. Not as wild or as ironic as him, but the same sort of like uninterested swagger in these sort of borderline rap verses. It shouldn't work on a Failure track, but it actually kind of does. Most of my other favourites are towards the back half of the album. Distorted Fields has this sort of like really grindy tone to it. It like feels like being trapped in a machine. These like sonorific guitar pulses and the choruses just sort of up the sort of artificiality of the whole thing. It's kind of cool. Heavy and Blind is quite straightforward, but I do really like the big percussive build-up in the pre-chorus that launches you into the chorus itself. It's a pretty effective climax of a song. There's a lot of that sort of drama in these final tracks. Apocalypse Blooms is cool. I think the mixing's absolutely on point on here. It like really adds emphasis and depth into this like repeated guitar strum that like makes it feel like a jackhammer pounding into your brain. It's like aggressively repetitive in like a really sort of vibrant, hypnotic way. And then I love the like elated buoyancy of Force Fed Rainbow, how the guitar dances through the verses and then explodes into these choruses, this big like beckoning call, come meet me in the static. I find it like really impactful. My favourite's probably the closer though, the Pineal Electorate. It's really theatrical, like very out of character for Failure honestly, but it like paints this picture of a narrator who has just sort of given up hope in humanity and is just sort of heralding their extinction through these like almost Beatlesy chord progressions and vocal harmonies. Yeah, there's definitely a sort of 60s vibe to it, and the like majesty of this like big piano coda with these chorus vocals singing over the top of it. It would easily be my favourite Failure closer if it weren't for Daylight being so damn good. So yeah, I think the individual cuts are less strong on this one than they were on The Heart Is a Monster, but as an album I think it might be a stronger sort of total piece. They're kind of neck and neck in my eyes. I think I'll put this one slightly lower because I love a good hook, but yeah, solid beat here again. I remember really liking this album when it released. If you go back and look at my 2021 list, you'll see it in there somewhere. I don't think it was like top 10 or anything, but it was, you know, more than good enough to make the list. And I particularly remember like considering Headstand to be like one of the songs of the year at that point. I don't know, it certainly doesn't click as well with 2024, Joe, I'll tell you that much. Headstand's still a great song, don't get me wrong. Or more to the point, it has a great ending. It sort of meanders a bit, honestly, but I do really love the glossy guitar inflections in the chorus, which are then allowed to sort of take centre stage for the sort of back half of the tune. This sort of lush instrumental section that really does sort of set itself apart as like one of the highlights of this record. And there's other stuff I enjoy on here as well, for sure. Like Submarines has a pretty cool little guitar lick. It sort of punctuates the vocal delivery with this little like ascending, descending sort of run of notes. Not much beyond there on that song, but that's enough to sort of keep me interested, I guess. Bring Back the Sound is fairly unremarkable, but pleasant. Like just some nice guitar arpeggios and fairly impactful chorus. I think there's a fairly strong run with the final three tracks. Long Division isn't particularly a standout structurally, I just really like what it does like tonally. The guitars are very Pink Floyd and the bass is very Electric Wizard, I guess. Like it's super tuned down, it feels like tremorous, right? It's like an earthquake just rocking this otherwise quite hazy, spacey, melodic tune. And the bass is then used to pretty good effect on Bad Translation as well, which honestly sounds even more like a doom metal song or something. It's very minimal with its playing, like there's just like occasional thunderous notes that just take their time to sort of slowly unravel the song to you. And finally, Half Moon is alone in Failure's discography in that it's just so incredibly stripped back. Like, predominantly this song is just like acoustic fingerpicking and a pleasant vocal melody. I've got to say the vocals have changed up a lot on here, like looking back at Long Division as well. There's almost like a sort of Bono-y quality to them, like it's a lot cleaner, a lot less gruff than I'm used to from these guys. But yeah, Half Moon puts that to pretty good use, I think. And even when it starts to bring in more layers, more of an impactful climax with these various effects and guitars upon guitars, it's all still very like compositionally quite simple, and I think it works really well as like what is currently the final song in these guys' career. I don't know if there's any more to come, but as it stands, this is the closer for their discography, right? And I think having something simple like this works wonders against a backdrop of songs that have been far more complex and dense, right? So yeah, there's definitely stuff I like on here. None of these tracks I've listed would be top 10 in their discography, is the thing. And the tracks I haven't listed, I honestly don't remember. They've just sort of slipped straight off my brain. I've listened to this album more than any of the others as well, because I'm less familiar with it, so I thought I'd take more time with it, and it's just not sinking in. I don't know. Obviously, like, it's a Failure album. There's a great deal of attention to detail on here. The production is, as ever, bold and majestic, and all those words that I've repeated over and over again. Soaring, you know, I'm sure we're not tired of that one yet. But yeah, the songs just, I don't know, they're just not as good. What else can I say? I think as a listening experience, it's a good vibe. I was almost considering putting it in D tier, but I think the energy and the ambience of the record elevate it to higher heights than that. But yeah, I think we're gonna have to settle for C here. Oh, and Failure? Hey, Failure? Failure? Hey? Where are the segues? Oh, well, this is awkward. So earlier in this video I was talking some smack about Steve Albini's production work on Comfort, and now here we are, and the guy has died. Genuinely hit me quite hard. I'm not usually one to get soppy over celebrity deaths or whatever, but this guy is like an icon of the alternative rock space. He's produced so many of like my favourite albums of all time. Plus, he was in Big Black and Shellac, which I love, frankly. Songs about fucking and 1000 Hertz and Dude Incredible as well, the latest Shellac album, all really good. So yeah, much respect to the guy, and yeah, that really sucks. Doesn't change my opinion about Comfort though. Anyway, that said, here we are at the end of the video. Failure are a weird band to me because their style hasn't really changed much. I mean, I guess the biggest jump was between Magnified and Fantastic Planet, but like they've always had a bit of that space rocky stuff in there. They've always been like a sort of metal influenced, heavy riffing alt rock band. Like there's not a great deal of diversity in this discography, but yet somehow like sometimes they do that incredibly well, and sometimes it just doesn't hit the mark, and it's kind of hard to sort of identify at times exactly why that is. Regardless, I hope my desperate attempts at justifying my ranking placements here made some sort of sense, and I absolutely stand by my positionings here. Fantastic Planet will always be one of my favourite albums of all time, and the rest is like a whole rainbow of quality. Some stuff that I will be going back to on a regular basis, and some stuff that I will probably promptly forget about again after this video. If you're interested in getting into the band, then obviously start with Fantastic Planet, like obviously. And then if you're looking for something a bit meatier and heavier, Magnified, and if you're looking for something a bit spacier and proggier, The Heart is a Monster. But the discography is relatively small, and you can probably dig through most of it and find something worth listening to, especially if you're into, you know, grunge or any of the sort of weirdo 90s stuff that followed in its wake. As ever, if you have any recommendations for any artists you want me to check out and give this whole treatment to, then drop them in the comments. I'll be happy to do that. God, I'm good at this. And with all that said, until next time, I'll see you.